Hi, my name is Taylor York, and I will be talking about the impact of our changing climate and what it has on America's economy, examples of this occurring, what government and other organizations have been doing to combat this problem, and what still needs to be done, especially in regards to helping those in poverty. The weather and its conditions are highly unpredictable. It is often not known until a few days ahead of time when a major storm may strike. However, in the more recent years, extreme weather has been more frequent and damaging than in past years. Take, for example, this picture from Hurricane Sandy 5 years ago, which took more than 117 lives and left thousands homeless. This major storm also cost more than $71 billion in damage. It is also noted by COSA that in the year 2016, there were more than 15 extreme weather events, with losses totaling over 15 billion in the US. This number only seems to rise, and the rise of global warming has only made this number worse. Extreme weather is costing the United States dearly, including its taxpayers. There have been more than 84 major disaster declarations and $1 billion worth of spending during these extreme events. Most of these events range from floods to hurricanes. The U.S. has issued more than 13,000 major disaster declarations, and the total damage from these events have been over $1 trillion. More than 2,000 Americans have died from extreme weather events from 2011 until now. This number is estimated to increase, according to the article by Cosa, Peterson, and Marino. Scientists from NASA state that the rise in sea levels and temperatures are adding to the growing extreme weather conditions. In Maryland, the temperatures have risen 1.2 degrees in the past century, and the sea levels in Virginia has risen 7 inches. Climate models estimate that these sea levels will continue to rise and temperatures will also increase. These conditions are estimated to lead to hurricanes and damage, especially along the shorelines. In our own backyard, the Mississippi River has reached 46 feet in the last month due to storms and heavy rain, which can lead to levee breaches as different storms hit. The National Climate Assessment notes that the global, long term, and unambiguous warming trend is expected to continue, and this warming will create more record setting extremes. These extremes will cause more heat waves, droughts, wildfires, storms, hurricanes, and floodings, which can ultimately not only have an impact on our crops and economy, but also our citizens. According to the information obtained by the NASA organization, the sea levels may display a steady increase over the past decades, which you can see from the top chart. Temperatures also display a similar pattern displayed by the bottom chart. These patterns could have devastating effects for our country, including flooding, severe storms, and heat waves. Scientists and researchers agree that climate change has become a reality. Warming temperatures, increase in the number of hot days, and an increase in the heat index have all been observed in this century. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change has concluded that although these other factors like volcano activity has changed our climate, human activities are only adding to these worsening issues by increasing the CO2 in our atmosphere, which alters the rainfall patterns. Put more simply, since the 1970s when industrialization took off, we have seen a 30% increase in CO2 emissions caused by burning fossil fuels for our car and deforestation. This over time increases rainfall, temperatures, and in turn natural disasters. This climate change will increasingly affect the poor populations. These populations do not usually have adequate access to drinking water and food, and their health could decline exponentially as a result to these weather events. These people who live paycheck to paycheck are also left less able to prepare for and recover for these type of storms. Some struggles that poor Americans encounter when dealing with damaging storms include not having enough money for moving expenses, according to the Federal Reserve. The cost of preparing and evacuating for these storms can also quickly add up. Before storms hit, people usually need to board up windows, have extra food and supplies for a few days, have gas to evacuate or buy plane tickets, and have accommodation for family pets. Few poverty-induced people do not have adequate funding for this and are left to tailor the storms with the bare minimum and try to survive. Some government aid is provided for these people, but the most vulnerable populations usually never see this aid at all. Some people are unable to apply for homeowners insurance, according to the Miami Herald. Undocumented immigrants also cannot receive cash aid or unemployment assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Also, typically poorer states along the South and Gulf are more likely to encounter these extreme hurricanes and storms. The poor usually does not have unlimited resources and instead are focused on day-to-day survival. Having extra money stored away for disasters may pose a problem for these populations. They may also not have the means to evacuate, as mentioned in previous slides. For example, Hurricane Katrina, many people did not evacuate the city because they did not have a vehicle. 2000 U.S. Census data projected that more than 50% of poor households in New Orleans did not own a vehicle. If the family doesn't own a vehicle, gas prices following the storm increased due to the factor in of replacement costs, making it even more difficult to evacuate. Insurance was also inadequate for homeowners to rebuild or repair. Poor communities have little access to disaster warning system, disaster responses, or sturdy construction. Roads and bridges may be able to withstand storms. These countries where this occurs often takes a toll financially, leaving little tax base to support and rebuild the efforts. According to McMonan, it is a cycle of poverty that occurs because of the lack of resources. Healthcare is also minimum, and the nutrition of these people may be low, leaving them unable to work and support the economy. Hurricane Katrina was an example of how extreme weather not only impacted poor populations, but how storms could magnify socioeconomic inequalities. Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans, disproportionately affected the poor populations. Poverty losses during this storm ranged from 70 to 125 billion, and more than 1,400 lives were lost. New Orleans is regarded as one of the most poor metropolitan areas in the country. Without the low-class citizens of New Orleans, the richer parts, such as the French Quarter, couldn't survive as well, since this meant there would be no workers to entertain tourists. The poor areas were also 83% African American, which highlighted a racial aspect to this. In a Gallup poll survey, 60% of blacks reported that the government was slow to respond to their needs after the storm, whereas only 20% of whites reported on this. This racial underpinning made it even more politically difficult to rebuild the city. This is because of the difficulties the poor class had for relocation and shelter, and lack of distrust towards the government. Half of those who did escape did not return back to the area. The city was left in shambles because of this, and it took many years to repair due to the slow response of the government and the billions of dollars cost of damage. After the hurricane, one disaster relief organization known as FEMA was in crisis. When the hurricane hit, the country was in relief because it would majority impact the poorer populations, not the touristy areas of the city. However, after a few days, it became apparent that many of the poorer zones were without food, water, or shelter. Louisiana was overwhelmed, as it seemed their ties with the federal government were not that strong. FEMA was therefore met with many critics during this time. It was mentioned that the emergency management suffers from a lack of clear, measurable objectives, adequate resources, public concern, or official commitments. The levees in New Orleans were already poorly constructed due to poor planning, which President Bush was aware of. State and local agencies were not prepared to provide transportation and other basic means in case of crisis. Once the hurricane did hit, the government officials waited too long to issue an evacuation warning, and federal agencies were too slow to provide emergency responses. There was an obvious disconnect between preparedness and response. No one was prepared for how devastating the hurricane would be, and it was all too little too late. Since this devastation, FEMA has gone through many changes. The old president resigned, and there is a new one, Director Brock Long. FEMA was also taken on a community approach based on Obama's idea that businesses must help during natural disasters. Finally, they have focused on other investments rather than simply rebuilding. These investments include better levees, canals, wetlands, and insurance for those in need. However, FEMA is still listed under Homeland Security, which focuses on other things like terrorism rather than just disaster relief. There is also no sure plan to help the poorer citizens, and most of the affluent residents still have the upper hand when dealing with storm aftermath. Still, this organization and others are on the right path to making a change. However, other policies implemented had only added to the climate crisis and growing poverty. Biofuels include liquid fuels made from organic matter, typically crops. This policy argues that ethanol and biodiesels will allow us to move forward with internal combustion engines while still reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. However, there are many skeptics surrounding the true success of this and what this process may cost Americans. Oxford International states that the biofuel policies may allow rich country governments to avoid difficult decisions about how to reduce the consumption of oil and may also drive up food prices. The World Bank estimates that this policy has already pushed over 100 million people into poverty. Since we have very little research on this topic, much of government does not even recognize this as a real issue. Businesses are realizing that climate change could put a damper in their operations. With the low carbon economy booming 3% each year, and the demand for power sources, including lithium ion for electric powered vehicles, corporations have now realized the business opportunity. The new electric powered technology is thought to decrease greenhouse gases, and the company Tesla has definitely invested in this industry. Other corporations, including Nike, IKEA, H&M, and Apple, have also invested in combating climate change. However, company scandals, including those at Exxon and Volkswagen, in which these organizations advertised a false eco-friendly product, has led to much distrust by the American people. Companies are still being seen as a big part of the climate problem and are expected to become a big part of the solution. Businesses have the responsibility to acknowledge the climate change crisis. The U.S. also has the responsibility to transition our workforce into one that values STEM research and that our nation needs to combat this climate change. Today, America has only 15% of the world's engineers and scientists. If we were to increase this number, we would have better technology to detect natural disasters and be able to respond more accordingly. Americans seem to be divided on how much to spend to battle the climate change. In a survey, it is indicated that 77% of respondents said they think climate change is a real issue, and 65% stated that the government should do something about it. 57% believe that climate change is occurring because of humans. However, 42% of these respondents wouldn't even pay $1 a month to do something about it, and 2/3 would not drastically change their lifestyles. Democrats were found to be more willing to pay than Republicans for the climate change and were more likely to believe in the devastating effects of climate change. As you can see, Americans seem to be divided on the issue, with no clear leader emerging to fix the problems. One of the most compelling reasons why Americans are so reluctant to believe in climate change and thus do something about it is simply because there is not enough comprehensible information about the topic. The good news is that a majority of cities and government bodies are investing in things such as solar panels and better transportation systems to reduce carbon dioxide transmission. Humans are also taking small strides, such as reducing plastic waste, driving electric cars, and cutting back on electricity. A greater awareness of climate change and its implications still need to be realized. Talking to your friends or family or posting climate change facts on social media can start this momentum. Powering your home with renewable energy and investing in energy-efficient appliances can also help. States and federal governments may also come up with better policies that protect the most vulnerable populations when storms strike. Risk factoring can also help to know which populations are at the greatest risk during storms. In conclusion, climate change is a very real and especially disproportionately affects our most poor populations. However, as a nation, we can take small strides to reduce our carbon emissions. Climate change may not be something that Americans alone can cure, but we can take steps to reduce it and ultimately invest in our nation.